A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. Thank you for being a part of the program today. Coming up, we're going to get to some of your emails, as well as we've got an armed citizen story to talk about. And we've got something really disturbing in the state of Virginia to talk about as well. I mean, I know we've been talking about a lot of disturbing things in the state of Virginia, but this one popped up on Thursday evening when State Senator Bill Stanley took to Facebook and posted the following. He said, "Tonight, just now on the Senate floor, I tried to amend the state budget to give all of our men and women of Virginia Sheriff's Departments a 3% raise for this year. It was defeated, with all Democrats voting no. When I went to get a vote count from the clerk, Majority Leader Dick Saslaw came up to me and said this, 'Hey, Stanley, you want to know why your sheriffs didn't get a raise? Because they came to our committees and said that they weren't going to enforce our laws.' When I asked him which law he was talking about, he said gun control. I was shocked that the Democrats are now punishing our local sheriff's departments by eliminating a pay raise for them for their choice to protect and defend our citizens' Second Amendment rights. Democrats want to restrict a citizen's right to protect themselves, but won't pay our sheriff's deputies to protect Virginians. Hypocrisy," says Senator Stanley, "has a name." Now, I've got to say, so far we've not seen any response from Senator Saslaw, but I can't imagine that Senator Stanley would say this and just make this up out of a whole cloth, particularly when we've already seen retribution on the part of Democrat lawmakers seeking to enact their revenge. In this particular case, it was Senator Chap Peterson who had a bill that also kind of dealt with law enforcement. It was a bill that passed out of the state Senate 40-0. Even Senator Saslaw voted for this one, and it would have allowed law enforcement officers who were part-time law enforcement officers, when they retired, they could purchase their service weapon. Again, non-controversial, no big deal. It passes out of the Senate unanimously. Every Republican, every Democrat on board, gets over to the state house. In its first committee hearing, it's killed. And it was because this bill was authored by Senator Chap Peterson, who voted against Ralph Northam's gun ban bill. So Democrats turned on one of their own and killed a bill that had, the complete support of the Virginia State Senate. Now we see state Senate Democrats taking aim at another group of people who objected to Ralph Northam's gun control agenda, the sheriffs. But here's the thing. Just as when the House Democrats who killed Senator Peterson's bill missed the mark, I mean, they were trying to hurt Senator Peterson, but who they really hurt were these law enforcement officers. I got to be honest with you. I mean, yes, these county sheriffs are not going to get a 3% raise, but either are their sheriff's deputies. And by the way, not every county sheriff in the state of Virginia signed on to one of these Second Amendment sanctuary resolutions. 91 out of 95 counties may have passed these resolutions, but that gives you at least 4 sheriffs who apparently were not on board. And the sheriff's deputies are really the ones who I think are going to bear the brunt of this. Going back 4 years in the state of Virginia, the Virginia Sheriff's Association has been talking about how there's a big pay gap. Virginia, the 9th wealthiest state in the country, but sheriff's deputies are not paid 9th best in the country. As a matter of fact, in a lot of rural areas, retention is a huge problem because, frankly, you can make more money if you're lucky enough to get a factory job. You can leave and you can make more money than you do as a sheriff's deputy. I had somebody on Twitter tell me, try to come at me earlier today and say, well, you need a raise. And what about the teachers unions? Public teachers in the state of Virginia make about $16,000 more a year than the average sheriff's deputy does. So if you want to say that teachers don't make enough money, all right, well, then sheriff's deputies really don't make enough money. And by the way, this is a 3% cost of living increase. This is not, going to turn sheriff's deputies who might be making $27,000, $28,000 a year if you're a new deputy into Big Daddy Bloomberg. That's a cute one. I'd have to keep that in. Again, this is simply going to allow these deputies to put food on the table and maybe a roof over their head. That's it. And these were the folks who are going to be impacted the hardest, which in turn impacts Virginians. If, again, we continue to have this problem retaining good law enforcement officers. Ultimately, who does that hurt? Well, it hurts the sheriff's department, but the sheriff's department serves the community. And so ultimately, the community is being hurt. Now, Governor Ralph Northam said back in December that Second Amendment sanctuaries would not face retribution, would not face punishment. But so far, he has not said a word about the Virginia Senate Democrats killing that modest pay increase for sheriffs and sheriff's deputies in the state of Virginia. All right, I just had to vent. I just had to get that out of the way. Saw that this morning. Really ticked me off. Wrote about it for Bearing Arms, but had a little bit more to say about that. All right, let's get to some of your emails. Don't forget the email address, cam.edwards@bearingarms.com. Donald writing in, talking about the a recent militia muster that we've seen in a couple of counties in the state of Virginia, Bedford County, and I believe there was one other one. I don't think it was Tazewell, although they've passed a militia ordinance, but we've had a couple of counties in Virginia that have had a militia muster over the past week or so, maybe 2 weeks. And there have been hundreds of individuals who have turned out. And by the way, this is not a white supremacist militia. You've had Virginians of all races, colors, and creed at these events. But they, too, are there for one reason. They are concerned about their rights being stripped away. Donald says, noting the Bedford County militia and beyond, it should be observed, Article 4, Section 4 says the United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government. And in our constitutional republic, he says the only law deemed necessary is a, quote, well-regulated militia being necessary to a free state. Well, no, Donald, that's not the only law deemed necessary, because you have the Constitution that creates the federal government, right, including the co-equal branches of the executive branch, the judicial branch, the legislative branch. So no, it's not that the Constitution says that a militia is the only law necessary, or even the only law enforcement necessary. It also doesn't ban any other types of law enforcement. Anyway, he says, it seems to me that the Virginia state militias have every constitutional right to declare unconstitutional the want-to-be laws of the new rogue government and to use their reserved powers of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 to execute the laws of the Union. The militia seems to be the only government entity left. Well, in this case, particularly when you're talking about, the Bedford militia that had their militia muster, that's the unorganized militia, right? And under the Virginia Constitution, counties, I believe, do have the power to call out the militia and to order the militia, but I don't believe that Bedford County has done so. So to refer to a group of concerned citizens as the law is simply incorrect, Donald. I'm sorry, but that's just not the case. And, we talked about this a little bit with Sheriff Jenkins from Culpeper County on the program earlier this week. If you want to talk about that in case of emergency break glass reason for the Second Amendment, of God forbid a tyrannical government ever does get established, Federalist 46 explains, James Madison explains in Federalist 46 what that in case of emergency break glass moment would look like. And it would involve the body of the people capable of bearing arms that he notes is uncommon to be found around the country, but the United States, or found around the world, but in the United States, we the people do possess the right to keep and bear arms. And those militias electing local officers, but working with the states and working with elected officials at the state level would be able to overwhelm, in Madison's words, any sort of army or military force that a tyrannical government could try to put in place and impose that tyranny on the people. So ultimately, Madison talks about the right to keep and bear arms and the armed populace being a check, a preventative check on the establishment of tyranny. But if one ever did get established, then again, that's how the response would look like. We're not talking about armed mobs. We're not talking about lone wolves. We're talking about again, citizen engagement and citizen involvement, and the use of law to combat tyranny. But that doesn't mean that Tazewell County can order the militia, and all of a sudden the militia is the law in Tazewell County or the state of Virginia. That's just not how it works, and it's not going to be how it works. Now, I do believe that you are going to continue to see at the county level in the state of Virginia more county involvement regarding the ordering of the militia. But I don't think you're going to see it. Let me put it this way: I don't think it's imminent. You might see a burst of activity as we get closer to July 1st and the date that many of Ralph Northam's gun control bills will become law once he signs these pieces of legislation. And you may see this even continue into next year in the state of Virginia as far as the movement goes. But again, as a legal theory, Donald, I hate to burst your bubble, but I've got to burst your bubble. Randall writing in as well, and he says, the next time you talk with an attorney, ask them about this. Judges are not law enforcement. The courts do not have law enforcement powers. Courts do not have arrest powers over anyone. Courts do not cast rulings. The courts are not kings. The courts make findings and develop opinions and refer those to law enforcement to enforce. He says, if law enforcement does not agree with the courts, the chief law enforcement officer and or the district attorney has the discretion as to make an arrest and or prosecute or not. Even contempt of court orders are handed off to law enforcement to enforce. Randall says, we, the people and law enforcement personnel, need to understand that judges are not law enforcement. That's not their function in the justice system. This was explained to me, he says, by a constitutional attorney. And he says, like the nullification rules, these sorts of rules are not taught to lawyers any longer because that would contradict today's general understanding of the Constitution and would upset the status quo. He says all of these gun laws that are being created in Virginia will be found to be constitutional. They're pretty much the same laws created in Maryland, and they have already been in the Supreme Court for an opinion. But this doesn't make these laws right. If the police do not make an arrest by using their discretion, or a jury or one juror finds a defendant not guilty, then it doesn't matter what the law is because the ultimate power lies with we the people. The Supreme Court, Randall writes, has made an observation not too long ago. And he says, I'm paraphrasing here, as long as we have the right to vote and as long as we have the right to a jury trial, there can be no tyranny. Randall says, I'm curious what your lawyer guests would think of this position. Well, I will ask the next time I have an attorney on the program, Randall, but I have an opinion about what you had to say. And in fact, one of the things that I wrote about very early on in the Second Amendment sanctuary fight in Virginia was a piece in which I talked about how Ralph Northam might be able to put these gun laws on the books, but he's going to find that enforcing them is another matter entirely, because you're right. Judges, magistrates, these are not law enforcement. These are law arbiters, right? They cast their rulings, they cast their opinions, but they don't go out and arrest anybody. And you're right that sheriffs, police chiefs, officers on the street, they all have discretion. I don't know how many. In fact, I was having a conversation with a police officer this week. We were just having to be at lunch at the same place, same time, started up a conversation. And one of the other folks there in the restaurant said, well, help me out with discretion here. He's like, if you are driving down the road and you see somebody that's got an expired tag or something like that, he said, you don't pull every one of them over. And he said, well, no. He said, if I'm not on my way to another call, maybe I'll pull them over. But if I can, it's not that every time he sees a law being broken, a minor infraction, he's going to pull that person over. On the other hand, as he said, he's not going to look away or let somebody slide if he sees a violent crime being committed. Right. Now, in Virginia, we already have a number of prosecutors saying that they will not enforce the state's drug laws when it comes to marijuana possession. Drug trafficking, yes. But simple possession, no. Now, the law technically doesn't give them the discretion to do so, but they have the discretion to do so. Some judges have pushed back on this, though, Randall. And so it's interesting when you talk about, judges being able to enforce the law. We've actually had at least one judge, actually, I think it might have even been an appeals court in Portsmouth, Virginia, where the local prosecutor said, look, I'm not going to prosecute any of these Mr. Marijuana cases. You can make these arrests, but I'm going to dismiss these cases. And the judge basically said, well, I'm not going to let you dismiss all these cases. You got to come up with an individual reason for every one of these cases why you're not proceeding. So they can push back a little bit. It's not that judges have no power, but when it comes to law enforcement, you're right. Law enforcement is given great discretion in terms of how they choose to enforce these laws. You get into jury nullification, and I firmly do believe that if, let's say, Senate Bill 16, Dick Saslaw's gun ban bill, had ultimately gone through the legislature in Virginia, had become law, and so it would have been a felony to simply possess your AR-15 or an 11-round magazine, not even a 12-round magazine, but an 11-round magazine. Anything over 10 rounds would have been a felony. Suppressor possession would have been a felony. I think in many counties in the state of Virginia, it would have been, very difficult to find law enforcement willing to make an arrest on simple possession of those items. It would have been, I think, equally as difficult to find a county attorney who was willing to bring charges for simple possession of those items. And I think it would have been darn near impossible to find a jury of 12 peers to convict their neighbor for simply possessing one of these items. So you're right. We, the people, do ultimately have a great deal of power. Now, the one thing that I would say as well about this, Randall, is that 97% of the time, those cases never go to a jury trial. So you can talk about jury nullification, but one thing to keep in mind is that most defendants don't ever see a jury. If you've got a prosecutor, if a prosecutor were to try every case that came before them, the judicial system would grind to a halt. And so instead you get the plea bargains. Right. So you get we're gonna charge you with 8 offenses and you plead guilty to 2 of them, and we'll knock down your proposed sentence down to a couple of years. But if you insist on going to trial, we're going to try you for all 8 of these charges. You go away, get put away for 40 years as opposed to 2. What do you want to do? Again, when it comes to the enforcement of these gun control laws in Virginia, if hypothetically speaking, I had been arrested for simple possession of an AR-15, and I was looking at a felony charge, and I probably would have been arrested for, a quote unquote large capacity magazine. Probably would have been arrested for a suppressor. Would I take my chances in the county that I live with a jury of 12? Yeah, I would. If I lived in Fairfax County, Virginia, would I take my chances with a jury of 12 of my peers? I would not. So it's also something that is not a hard and fast strategy that can apply statewide. But I do appreciate you writing in. And again, the next time I talk to an attorney, I will ask that question. Malcolm writing in says, now conservatives in Oregon are making noise about dividing their rural areas away from Portland, as they are sick of the liberal cities voting in laws contrary to their morals and values, in particular their Second Amendment rights. The movement is growing. The conservative outrage over being controlled by the liberal cities is sparking a resist movement, he says, in Oregon. He said, we should take courage here in Illinois that with Virginia, Oregon, California, New York, and others that are calling for protecting rural/conservative America's values and beliefs, that we will not comply. I think that, Malcolm, and I don't know a whole lot about the situation there in Oregon. I've seen maybe a couple of headlines. In fact, DePat wrote in as well talking about this. He said there are many counties in eastern Oregon wanting to merge with Idaho. He says, for some strange reason, I can't link this, but if you search for Greater Idaho, it will show. And he sent along a couple of pictures showing what Greater Idaho would look like. And basically, Northern California, most of Oregon outside of the Portland area, and then all of Idaho would be Greater Idaho. I got to be honest with you. I mean, I think it's certainly going to be outside of the mainstream of thought, but it would be, I think, a very interesting thought exercise, if nothing else, to try to figure out, okay, how can the map be redrawn to provide for less conflict, quite frankly, between these two polar opposite views of what the United States should look like. Because living in a 50-50 country, as we pretty much do, we're always at each other's throats. and 50% of the country is deeply unhappy with what the other 50% of the country is doing. And that means 100% of the people are deeply unhappy with the political process, or at least close to 100% are deeply unhappy. Could this be fixed, or could this be, if not fixed, at least made a little bit better at the state level anyway, if you were to reconfigure some states' borders? We've got West Virginia talking about welcoming in Virginia counties. And I wouldn't be opposed to becoming a part of West Virginia. They'd have to reach pretty far into Virginia because, Farmville's like the geographic center of the state, or pretty close to it. But again, I'm not opposed to that idea. I think the idea of at least exploring, is there a way to alleviate some of the tensions that we have in this country through not redistricting, but through rebordering the states of the union? You know what? I'm willing to take a look. Let's get some smart people in a room and have them draw up some maps and let's see what they come up with. Right? Hey, listen, you don't have to accept it. You have to if you come down and you don't like it, you say, nah, it's a horrible idea. But I'm worth taking a look. I think it's worth taking a look. Anyway, that is going to do it for this edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. I want to thank you for being a part of the program, not just today, but each and every day. Miss E, my lovely bride, is back on her chemoimmunotherapy treatment. So if you're the praying kind, please do say a prayer for her that, first of all, the stuff works. And secondly, it doesn't make her feel too awful, because it can have that effect. Listen, I do want to thank you and have a great weekend. We'll be back with you Monday with another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. Don't forget, you can subscribe to the program, never miss an episode, by subscribing to Town Hall Media on YouTube. Also, you can subscribe to Bearing Arms, Cam and Company on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, townhall.com's podcast page. You can become a VIP member of Bearing Arms as well at bearingarms.com. Exclusive analysis, commentary, stories, and more each and every day. And of course, you get the reward not only of that additional content, but you get to know that you are supporting Second Amendment journalism, bringing you the latest Second Amendment news and information from all across the nation. Have a great weekend. We'll see you soon with another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company.